Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
In the Old Testament, the vine is always a picture of Israel. Who is it in the New Testament? It's Christ himself, right? And I only know of one vine that can withstand the fire. It's the same one that was able to be in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And had they just put their hope in him, they would have been able to withstand the fire of Babylon to come. And yet they didn't, and they couldn't, because their hope was in man. Their hope was in their kings and in their leaders, rather than in Christ himself.
Israel's story is laid bare, from failed leadership and wasted potential to a long history of rebellion against God's grace. Yet even in judgment, God reveals his deeper purpose, not destruction, but restoration. He reminds his people that he acted for his name's sake, preserving them despite their wandering hearts. This passage calls us to a fresh start, renewed hope rooted in God's faithfulness, a deeper hunger for his ways over our own, and a transformed heart that turns from rebellion to obedience. The same God who confronted Israel's past offers us a new beginning today, inviting us to leave behind what was and step into what he is ready to restore. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezekiel as he continues his message, A Fresh Start for Hope, Hunger, and Heart.
We are up to chapter 19 today. We're almost doing 2 chapters tonight, it looks like. We're going to start in chapter 19, verse 1, and go through almost the whole way through chapter 20. That's what we're looking at tonight. So I'll remind you of the sections of the book of Ezekiel so that we know where we're at. The opening section of the book of Ezekiel is chapter 1, 2, and 3, and that was Ezekiel's commission. And we're almost finished up with the second section, which is Ezekiel's prophecies towards Judah. Remember, he's already in Babylon. He was taken to Babylon during that second attack when Babylon came through. And so he's been talking not only to the Jews that are there exiled in Babylon, but he's also been addressing a lot of this to the Jewish nation that's still back in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Now, you remember, too, it's important to remember the scenery. When he was exiled to Babylon in 597 BC, a lot of them thought that, well, that was it. That's as far as Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon was going to come in attacking them. Now they're going to leave us alone. Because Nebuchadnezzar set up the vassal king, Zedekiah, to run things. And so everybody thought, well, that's it. He's not going to come back. He's not going to bug us anymore. And these messages from Ezekiel are to remind them, no, this promised captivity of 70 years is yet coming. There will be another wave of attack. So he's continually trying to remind them of that. And have you ever gone through something difficult and then you think, oh, sure, the pressure's off. I can go back to normal. Well, that's kind of how those in Judah were living at this point. And so we'll get into the future prophecy sections coming up very, very shortly. In fact, in the third section of the book from chapter 25 through 32, even much of that is future prophecy that he gives to these foreign nations. And then certainly the whole rest of the book is some exciting restoration prophecies that we'll get into shortly as we get through the book. So the Lord has been describing to Israel in vivid pictures where they went wrong, what they've been doing wrong, and how to recover from it. This whole section from chapter 4 through 24 has been not only, here are your sins, Judah, but here's what you can do about it to recover and come back. Chapter 19 and 20 tonight really speaks of Israel's inner cravings and the things that they're lusting after and desiring after. And our earthly, default position is to crave all the wrong things. I don't know if you've thought about that, but you don't have to teach a 3-year-old, you don't have to teach them to not love food and chocolate and all the stuff that we have to moderate, right? You do love chocolate, don't you? Okay. So we have to teach them to moderate these things because we have natural lusts for things of this world that we have to curb. And some of them have to be completely done away with in order to serve Christ. And so these 2 chapters really address that, their inner cravings. And so we've titled the message today, A Fresh Start for Hope, Hunger, and Heart. Because Israel is in need of a fresh look at what they're craving. That heart condition of what are they truly after? What is it that's truly leading them? maybe is a good way to say it. So, and then it should be a challenge, obviously, to us today. What are we craving? What are we driving hard after. Maybe we need a fresh start. Maybe we need to reevaluate the great pursuits and cravings and lusts of our own heart. So we're going to see some different cravings tonight that just may very well need to be adjusted. So chapter 19 opens up with the entire chapter really, I think, makes our first point for us. This chapter, as short as it is, it's only 14 verses. He addresses the leaders back in Jerusalem. In fact, they're, King Zedekiah is what we call him, that's on the throne. He was of the lineage of David, but he was just established by Babylon. They put him on the throne. They took away Jeconiah and they put his uncle Zedekiah on the throne. And this chapter is really a lament about how poorly these last couple of kings did. In fact, you'll see in the chapter that the Lord doesn't even call them kings. He calls them princes as a bit of an insult. And so I think the first real challenge, what this chapter is really presenting, is that Israel followed these kings. Wherever they went, they followed after these kings. These kings followed after other governments. They had their political alliances all wrong. And so I think we're going to phrase this chapter 19 in the sense that they put their hope in their kings and in their government. And I think that could be the same mistake that we could still make today. That we could put our hope there and we could think, well, that's going to solve all of our problems. If I just rely on them, they will make it all right. And that's not the way to go. And I believe this chapter makes that point. And so what's our hope in is the question that chapter 19 presents. So let's look at chapter 19, verse 1. As for you, take up a lamentation, or a mourning, right? Take up a lamentation for the princes of Israel and say, what was your mother? She was like a lioness among lions. She lay down among young lions. She reared up her cubs. So in verse 3, so she brought up one of her cubs, and he became a lion. And he learned to tear his prey. That's what a lion's supposed to do. And he devoured men. Then in verse 4, then nations heard about him. And he was captured in their pit. And they brought him with hooks to the land of Egypt. And so this is an anthropomorphic scenery of Israel herself being pictured as a lioness, giving birth to all of these different lions as we go down through. And so this first lion is one of Israel's kings, Jehoaz, who became the king. And he's the one that it refers to here in verse 4, that he was taken away into the land of Egypt. He got some prominence. He was King Josiah's son. He got some prominence. And Egypt wanted to put him down, and sure enough, they did. And so you'll see as we go through this chapter that this is a lament over a couple different kings, these latter kings in Judah. They're all mentioned here really in an analogous type of way. So we know from history that it was King Josiah's son, Jehoaz, that was the one taken to Egypt in fetters, in chains. In fact, we can read this in 2 Kings chapter 23. And even from the context of this chapter, we know that that's who this is talking about. So it's going to start to make the case about how all of these kings of Israel that came up through, how they went astray. And so verse 5, we continue, and it says, then she saw, as she waited, that her hope was lost. So who is she? Who is this her? Well, it's Israel as a nation. This lioness, she saw that her hope was lost when King Jehoaz was taken captive, is the idea. And so then she saw as she waited that her hope was lost. So she took another of her cubs and made him a young lion. And verse 6, and he walked among the other lions. He became a young lion. He learned to tear his prey. He devoured men. And in verse 7, he knew how to destroy their fortified towers and lay waste to their cities. And the land was in desolation as well as its fullness because of the sound of his roaring. So it doesn't yet tell us who we're dealing with here, but we know from the forthcoming verses that this is going to be Judah's king Jehoiachin. He had quite a roar. You'll see as we read we went back to the Kings and the Chronicles and we read about him, he made a public pronouncement of his kingship and it drew attention to himself, really. And that's why Babylon ends up invading and putting him under. But one thing I want to draw your eyes to make the application here is verse 5. It said that as Israel's kings are struggling here, then it says in verse 5 that when she saw as she waited that her hope was lost. Isn't that fascinating that as Israel has king after king after king, the idea is going to come out here that she was putting her hope in these kings. right? And I think sometimes we could do the same thing, like, oh, that other person's taking care of this for me. I don't even have to worry about it, right? And that's the downside of what we're saying here. We shouldn't invest what God has given to us into somebody else, right? If our government is doing something wrong, we shouldn't just say, well, that's our government. No, we need to still make the right decisions ourselves. Don't invest our futures in letting someone else do something that would not be appropriate. So they're supposed to put their hope in God, not in a government. Do you remember this going back to when we were in the book of Joshua and Judges, and then into 1 Samuel? Do you know that Israel was never supposed to have a king? God never asked them to have a king, right? What did God want them to have for a form of government? Does anybody remember? A theocracy, right? God established himself as their ruler, and then every time they got in trouble, God would just put his spirit in someone and raise up a judge to deliver them from a current situation. He wanted to be their king, and yet they called out for a man to do this. And they find, even here in this prototype here, where they find that it's hopeless to put their hope in a man to run what we should have invested in God for God to run. And so that's their problem, is misplaced hope. So God had warned them, even back when they came to Samuel and they said, Samuel, we need a king because we want to what? We want to be like the other nations. It was in 1 Kings, I think it's in 1 Kings chapter 8, or it might have been the Samuels, I can't remember, that they asked for a king because they wanted to be like the other nations. They didn't want to be what God wanted them to be. They wanted to put their hope in a person. How sad. Verse 8 now, it says, Then nations put themselves against him. We're talking about King Jehoiachin here. Nations put themselves against him all around from their provinces, and they spread their nets over him. He was captured in their pit. In verse 9, they put him in a cage with hooks and brought him to the king of Babylon. They brought him in hunting nets so that his voice would be heard no more on the mountains of Israel. Isn't that interesting, that note there at the end, that it specifically tells us that the reason Babylon captured Jehoiachin was because they wanted to silence him, right? So sometimes the world just wants to silence you simply because you're a believer, because you're God's chosen, and certainly that was their motivation. A lot of nations sometimes would conquer because of spoil or plunder, or you have a natural resource that they want. Nope, they just wanted him silenced. Sometimes, have you ever asked yourself why somebody comes against you? Like, why do they hate me? Why does that coworker hate me? What have I done to them? It might be nothing other than you're God's chosen, and that's conviction to them. And they don't like that, and they want that silenced. And so they come against the believers often. Verse 10, your mother was like a vine in your vineyard, planted by the waters. It was fruitful and full of branches because of abundant waters, and it had strong, thick branches fit for scepters of rulers, and its height was exalted above the clouds. It's picturing how Israel herself was like a fruitful place. It should have been able to work. They should have been able to be successful, is the idea. And in verse 11, and it had strong, thick branches fit for scepters of rulers, and its height was exalted above the clouds, so that it was seen in its exaltedness with the mass of its foliage. And so this glorious picture of all the potential of what Israel could be. It's very common in the scriptures for Israel to be pictured as a vine, right? And perched for success is the picture given to us here in these verses. It had every possibility to flourish and be blessed and to be able to prosper, and yet it didn't. It was able to have great leaders. It mentioned there in verse 11, it had branches that were fit for scepters of rulers, right? The idea that it had the ability to have righteous kings that would serve the Lord and do good. And you have to ask yourself, like, what went wrong? Well, because they put their hope in man instead of putting their hope in God. Verse 12, but it was uprooted in wrath. It was cast down to the ground, and the east wind dried up its fruit. Its strong, thick branch was torn off, so that it dried up. The fire consumed it. So in verse 13, now it is planted in the wilderness, in a dry and thirsty land, and fire has gone out from its thick branch. It has consumed its shoots and its fruit. So this now the picture of Israel being judged and being taken to Babylon and being consumed in the land of Babylon. It's interesting. Israel's pictured as the vine, and it's being pictured here in the end as being consumed, being taken away. In fact, we'll continue in verse 14, and then we'll make the point. It's being consumed from shoots and fruits, so that there is not in it a strong, thick branch or a scepter to rule. What's the scepter again? The leader, right? There can't be a leader anymore. This is the lamentation and has become a lamentation. Interesting that in the Old Testament, the vine is always a picture of Israel. But who is it in the New Testament? It's Christ himself, right? In the New Testament. And I only know of one vine that can withstand the fire. It's the same one that was able to be in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And had they just put their hope in him, they would have been able to withstand the fire of Babylon to come. And yet they didn't, and they couldn't, because their hope was in man. Their hope was in their kings and in their leaders, rather than in Christ himself. In fact, it's in both Old and New Testament, in Deuteronomy and in the book of Hebrews, that it calls our God a consuming fire. The one that could stand in the fire with the three Israelites in the days of Daniel is the same one that is a consuming fire. And there's no fire that can consume that. It's Christ himself. And that's who they needed to reach out to. That's who they needed to look to rule them and put their hope in. But this lamentation is all because they look to their leaders. Well, surely they'll deliver me. Don't ever invest that kind of power in a leader, as good as they try to be. And so their hope was misplaced. They had a craving for their leaders to be the ones to give them hope, and their craving was misplaced. Oh, it was a proper craving to want hope, but they misplaced it. And now we go to chapter 20, and our next point is drawn from most of the first half here of chapter 20, and that is this: that generation after generation, they put their hunger in their idols. Now again, they have a hunger for, let's say, religion. Okay, that's not necessarily bad, but they're placing it in the wrong place. They have a hunger for religious experience, let's say. That's not necessarily bad, but where should you put that is the problem, is the question. And so that's where we begin chapter 20 now, with this craving for, this hunger for a religious experience. In chapter 20, verse 1, we begin: "Now it happened in the 7th year, in the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, that some of the elders of Israel came to inquire of Yahweh, and they sat before me," Ezekiel says. And in verse 2, "The word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the elders of Israel, and say to them, Thus saith Lord Yahweh, Do you come to inquire of me? As I live, declares Lord Yahweh, I will not be inquired of by you." In verse 4, "Will you judge them? Will you judge them, O son of man?" He's talking to Ezekiel when he says that. "Make them know the abomination of their fathers." And so I do want to point out, first of all, that all of this is happening relatively quickly. We get another date here in verse 1. And so 2 years after his commission, in the beginning couple of chapters, is when this is happening. And so from the beginning of the book of Ezekiel till now, it's only been 2-year period of time that all of these visions and revelations have come to him, and he's been passing off this information to the people there in Babylon and sending letters back to Judah. This is only 1 year after all of the events of chapter 8 began. And so everything from chapter 8 until now was in that 1 year ago, and now we're only 2 years into his ministry, and all of these things have already happened. So these elders of Israel there in Babylon, they had come to him earlier. In chapter 14, we saw them come to him. This was just a few months ago in Ezekiel's time. And they got the same response. At that point, they came to inquire of Ezekiel. It's sort of like when you're desperate, you'll go anywhere, right? You'll ask everybody for help, for advice. And that's the position they're in. Their heart is not connected to Ezekiel or to their God. But there's Ezekiel. There he is, down on the street corner. Let's go talk to him. Let's ask him what he thinks of our situation. And God is repulsed by this. In fact, when they came the first time, back in chapter 14, God responded with causing them to look at the idols within their own heart. and look at their lustings, the things that they were lusting after. And now here in chapter 20, God responds by having them see the pattern that they and their fathers continue in. And so, in a way, he's already given them the answer that he's going to give them here in chapter 20, back in chapter 14, a few months ago. Then he said, here's your problem. You continue to lust after these other gods and these other idols and these other pursuits, and they're never going to satisfy you, and that's adultery against me. And here they come again, just a few months later, saying, hey, Ezekiel, I just thought we'd check in with you. What's the good word? And God tells them that is offensive. I mean, guys, imagine you're out cheating on your wife, and then one night you just come home and say, hey, I just thought we could, be together tonight and go out on a date. Your wife that you've been cheating on should say, no, let's make this right first. Let's fix this. Let's talk about this. And then maybe we could go out on a date, right? It's inappropriate to come to God and ask for something while you've been cheating on him. And that's what they do here, even a second time. And so don't wonder why God is so offended in verse 3 when he says, will you come and inquire of me? I don't think so. That's offense. God is offended in this. And so let's continue now here in verse 5. He's going to lay out to them this pattern that they refuse to break out of generation after generation. In verse 5 it begins. And this is what God says to Ezekiel to say unto them. Thus says Lord Yahweh, on the day when I chose Israel and swore to the seed of the house of Jacob and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, when I swore to them saying, I am Yahweh your God. Now what's he referring to? Let's get the picture here. He's referring to the days of Moses, when he first sent Moses to deliver them out of Egypt. God's going way back in their history, and he's saying, listen, let me tell you about when Moses first came to you to deliver you. And he continues here, and he says in verse 6, on that day I swore to them to bring them out from the land of Egypt into a land that I had selected for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all the lands. And in verse 7, I said to them, cast away each one of you the detestable things of his eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. And so here the first piece of evidence that God presents is that when Israel was first called by God in the days of Moses, it was a twofold call, right? When you got married, if you're married, okay, it was a twofold commitment, wasn't it? Think about it. You committed, I am yours for the rest of my life. And what did you also commit? I am not with anyone else for the rest of my life. That both happened at the exact same moment, right? And that was God's call to them, right? He says, get rid of the detestable things before your eyes, these idols of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. See, a commitment to God says, I'm committed to you, and I will not be with that. It goes together. It would never work in a marriage to just say, well, I just want half of that. I want to be married to you, but I still want that life too. Isn't that gross? Right? And yet that's what we try to do spiritually. We try to do that spiritually. We try to be like, oh, God is cool. Jesus, I go to church. And then what? 3 days later, we're out doing perverse things, cheating on God. And that was the call. So God starts off by saying, look, in the beginning, this was my call to you. Come be bonded to me. Come apart from those things and join me. It was a call to follow God into the promised land and also out of Egypt. Both. That was the call. And that is the same thing for us today. Verse 8, but they rebelled against me, and they were not willing to listen to me. Each one did not cast away the detestable thing of their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I said, I will pour out my wrath on them, to spend my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations among whom they lived, in whose sight I made myself known to them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So the idea here is that while they were still in Egypt, Israel, though willing to follow God, they did not want to give up their idols. And God's saying that was an utterly detestable thing.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.